Everybody. We're here this afternoon to talk about the Virginia Alternate Assessment Program. This is the Module 1 webinar. Module 1, that's a tough one to spit out with webinar. Anyway, thanks for joining us. We're going to be talking about preparing eligible students for the Virginia Alternate Assessment Program. My name is Sarah Susbury. I'm the Director of Student Assessment here at the Department of Education. And we have a number of other Department of Education staff online with us this afternoon who will be both presenting and also answering questions as they are submitted to us. So they will be introduced as we go through the presentation. So we'll go ahead and get started this afternoon. We're going to start out with a brief overview and a quick look back at prior to last year. Just a note that the VAAP portfolio design was a portfolio design, and that was in place for a number of years. And it's where students submitted collections of evidence that were consisting of work samples that teachers prepared for students to do during the day in their classrooms. So we have a very different design that was implemented for the first time last year. The design was replaced with a multiple choice test, and the test questions include 3 answer choices, and that could be delivered in either an online or a paper format, or potentially both, depending on the needs of the student. And the current VAAP does assess reading and mathematics in grades 3 through 8 and high school. And then we assess science in grades 5, 8, and also in high school. So the reading, math, and science assessments that incorporated in the VAAP have 35 multiple choice test items with 3 answer options each. And that consists of 30 what we refer to as operational test items that are scored and count toward the student's final score. And then there are an additional 5 field test items that are being tried out with students. So that's new test development that's occurring, and we're trying those new items out with students for the potential to appear on later tests in future years. But the items are designed to allow students maximum flexibility to answer questions independently and show what they've learned, and also to maintain test security. And it's important to know that the VAAP test items are measuring the Virginia Essentialized Standards of Learning, or what we refer to as the VSOL. And the VSOL are linked to the standards of learning, but they are reduced in depth, breadth, and complexity. And then the order of the test items is specific for the VAAP, in that we start with the easier items first, and then the test gets gradually more difficult as the student proceeds through the test form. And that's to maximize access for students. Most of the items are read to the students using text-to-speech functionality available in the online presentation, or the other option is that the examiner can read them to the student. So as I mentioned previously, the tests are available in an online format, and that's in the TestNav software. That's what Virginia uses to administer its state assessments. And then it's also available in a paper format. And really, decisions about which format the student would use are dependent on what the student really needs and what they're used to interacting with during an instructional environment. We don't have specific criteria forms that have to be followed for making that decision. We'll be talking a little bit later about test plans in this presentation and determining which format is better for students. And it may be that the student needs both paper and online, so that's an option as well. Students enter their responses to the items in an online environment or the paper test, depending on how they're taking the assessment. And then there's also an option that for students to respond to the examiner and using whichever communication modality they use on a regular basis. So we try to provide maximum flexibility for how the student will respond to the VAAP test items. And then we're talking about test conditions today, and we're also going to be talking about test accommodations and the differences between those two. First of all, testing conditions are available to all VAAP participants. So that encompasses 4 different categories: time and scheduling, the setting perhaps in which the test is administered, the type of presentation, and then response options or ways that the student can respond. So we have flexibility in those 4 areas. And again, those are considered testing conditions, and they're available to all students that are participating in VAAP. It does not have to be documented in the student IEP to have a specific testing condition. And that's in contrast to testing accommodations. And we have 4 specific accommodations that are available for the VAAP assessment. We have a Braille form. There's a form that, or an accommodation that allows for interpreting or transliteration of the test items. The test items can be read aloud. And then the 4th accommodation is what we refer to as an alternate representation of response options. So again, you'll hear more about those 4 test accommodations this afternoon. The accommodations do have to be documented in the student's IEP. So that's a pretty significant difference between a test accommodation and a testing condition in this assessment program. So let's take a quick look back to the previous spring 22, that we just completed that VAAP test administration. We administered over 22,000 assessments. The Department of Education conducted a survey to receive some feedback from directors of special education and division directors of testing, and also from teachers. We heard from about 100 directors, and about 216 teachers gave us some feedback as well. One of the things that we learned is that school divisions required or strongly encouraged teachers to use the VAAP practice items and to develop test plans. You'll hear about the practice items this afternoon, as well as developing that student test plan. Teachers also found that the training modules that the department offered and the other resources that we had on the VAAP page were helpful to them in preparing to administer the assessment, and also in preparing their students to take the assessment. So we'll talk to you about those resources today. And then some of the other feedback that we received through these surveys applied to needing to revisit or clarify the VAAP eligibility criteria. So looking ahead to the spring 23 VAAP administration, we have a statewide test window, which is fairly wide. It starts in February of 2023, February 27th, and it extends through June 23rd of 2023. So school divisions have the opportunity to set their own testing window within that wide window. We found that provided the most flexibility and potential for success to give school divisions as much time as they needed to be able to administer these assessments, knowing that some students took more than one session to be able to complete the assessment. So for today, we're going to work to prepare you for the spring 23 VAAP administration, and we're going to do that by talking about 3 different steps. The first step is eligibility decisions, or really making that determination of which students will participate in the Virginia Alternate Assessment Program. And then step 2, after you've determined eligibility, would be looking at how the students are going to access those test items. And you'll do that with practice items, and you'll hear a little bit more about that this afternoon. And then finally, step 3 is the consideration of a student test plan, or developing that documentation and that information about how that student is going to participate in the VAAP assessments. So I mentioned that there are a number of resources on the Virginia Department of Education webpage. We've given you the link to that page here, and you'll see that in the lower right-hand corner, there is a listing for VAAP, and that will take you directly to the VAAP resource page. So we hope that you will use that page, and additional information will be provided on that page as we go. And then as you can see, today is the last of the Module 1 presentations. So we will be posting a recorded version of these soon, along with providing the presentation slides to you as a registered participant. And then for today's session, we ask that you wait until the end of the presentation to submit your questions. There's a Q&A feature that you can use at the bottom of your screen. And again, as I said, the session is being recorded, and we'll select one of the 4 sessions to post on the website so that it will be available to you. And then finally, the last disclaimer that we have is that due to the number of participants that we have in these sessions, we are not going to be providing individual certificates of participation. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Deborah Johnson. She is a staff member also at the Virginia Department of Education in the Department of Special Education and Student Services, and she's going to talk about eligibility decisions.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to, as Sarah said, I'm going to run you through the eligibility decisions, and this is actually the step 1 in determining participation in the Virginia Alternate Assessment Program. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about what the purpose of the alternate assessment is. The VAAP is actually one of our state's one part of our state's assessment system for school-age children. It's specifically designed for those students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. And the VAAP is based on what we call the Virginia Essentialized Standards of Learning, or better known as the VSALs. And these are linked to the standards of learning, but have been reduced in depth, breadth, and complexity. We have some state guidelines out there for you all to use, or our IEP teams to use. It helps in guiding you in making that decision as to whether or not students participate in the alternate assessment program. Using this information in the guidelines will help to aid in that discussion of whether a student has what we call a significant cognitive disability, which is required for being eligible to participate in the alternate assessment. All information on students should be considered collectively, and the IEP team should not rely solely on IQ scores. The information in the guidelines pretty much represents what is traditionally found in the literature regarding the characteristics of children with children who have significant cognitive disabilities. Which students should participate? Only those students with the most significant cognitive disabilities are eligible to participate in the alternate assessment. Most of these students, but not all, have intellectual disabilities, autism, and multiple disabilities. Many of these students, but again, not all, were identified for special education services probably prior to entering kindergarten. The decision about which students should participate in the VAAP is often very difficult. These are some of the general learner characteristics for students with significant cognitive disabilities. Many of these students have communication difficulties. You'll see an uneven learning pattern in all domains. Most of them will have multiple disabling conditions along with an intellectual disability, motor impairments. You'll see difficulty learning new tasks, being able to maintain those skills, and then generalizing skills in other settings, as well as individualized methods of assessing information. Participation in the alternate assessment, or in VAAP, is not based on the following factors. And I'm not going to read all these to you, but just for instance, it should not be based solely on an IQ score or a disability category or label. It's not going to be, based on whether or not, the student's performance, how that's going to affect the accountability system. It's not an administrator decision. It's not based on what educational environment or instructional setting the student is in, or, even if they have visual or auditory disabilities. So let's take a look at the VAAP eligibility criteria. First of all, the IEP team the IEP team determines whether or not a student is eligible to participate in the alternate assessment. Again, I just want to reiterate that it's the IEP team decision. It's not a decision made by an administrator or any individual. It is done by the child's IEP team. That IEP team must consider current and historical documentation. The documentation may include, but it's not limited to, evaluation data, school records. You've got parent-teacher interviews, observations, any anecdotal notes, and previous IEPs. The IEP team has the responsibility to determine and document that the student meets all of the criteria by checking yes for each of the statements on the next slide. If team members determine that the student does not meet a specific criterion, in other words, they answer no, this indicates that the student is not a candidate for the Virginia Alternate Assessment Program. So let's take a look at the criteria. These are the actual 5 questions that are on the criteria sheet. First of all, does the student have a current IEP? Students with 504 plans are not eligible to participate in the alternate assessment, so the student has to have an IEP. The student has got to demonstrate significant cognitive disabilities, which we have the guidance document there to help walk you through that process. Does the student's present level of performance indicate the need for extensive direct instruction and or intervention in a curriculum that is based on what we call the Virginia Centralized Standards of Learning, or the VSALs. And, you know, the present level of performance should also indicate that the student requires direct and intensive instruction to learn those functional life skills. Also, does the student need explicit and intensive instruction and or extensive support in multiple settings in order to acquire and maintain and generalize those academic and life skills in order to be able to participate both at school, in their community, work, and home environments? And finally, is the student working towards educational goals that are outside or other than those prescribed for the standard or advanced studies diplomas? Again, participation decisions are made by the IEP team. And the IEP team makes the decision about which student takes it. The parents and the guardians, please remember, are key to this decision. They are part of that IEP team. School professionals should not make decisions without the parent or guardian input. And we have training materials and resources for IEP teams to help them in making that participation decision. So let's look at some implications for the students, you know, talking about short-term, long-term, and even longer term. First of all, students' instruction is going to be the student's instruction is less in depth, breadth, and complexity than the instruction of other students receiving instruction in the general curriculum. Long-term, students may not meet the requirements for the standard or advanced studies diploma. And even longer than that, students may not be eligible for some post-secondary training situations like military service or institutions or other jobs. This is very important, making sure that you're communicating with the parents and the guardians about the Virginia Alternate Assessment. Please make sure you're listening to them and respect their views. They know their child better than anyone. Just remember to treat them as equal partners in the education of their child. Again, they are important members of the IEP team. You know, show up where they are in the community, organizations, and use interpreters if you need to bridge that potential cultural and linguistic barriers. So let's take a look at a couple of students and run them through the criteria. This is Megan. She's a 5th grade student who's been identified with an intellectual disability. She participates during instruction and works well with her peers. She actually performs all of her personal care tasks independently. And it's reported that at home, she completes her chores, she'll clean, prepare food and snacks with minimal assistance. In the academic areas, if we look at math, she does make quite a few errors in multi-step problems. She has difficulty applying the correct operation and many practical.
Okay, I think we've lost Deb this afternoon. We'll go ahead and continue with a description of Megan. Megan, again, is the 5th grade student. She, in mathematics, she has errors in multi-step problems, difficulty applying the correct operation in practical problems, and uses calculators and manipulatives for basic math calculations. On the 4th grade math test, she scored a 325 in the previous year. For reading, Megan has an issue with decoding skills. She has weak reading comprehension skills and is actually about 3 years below grade level. And after she reads, she has difficulty in completing a verbal summary of what she has read. She can place pictures in sequential order for accurate retelling of a story, however. And as a 4th grader on the reading test, she scored a 275. So for the eligibility questions regarding Megan, first of all, criteria 1, does she have an IEP? And yes, she meets this criteria. She has a current 22-23 IEP, and she's enrolled in grade 5. For criterion 2, does she demonstrate a significant cognitive disability? And no, Megan does not. Based on the review of resources, that's what was determined for criteria 2. And then the next criterion is related to the curriculum. So does she meet the curriculum that is used for students that are participating in VAAP? And the answer is no. She's receiving core standards of learning instruction in the general education classroom with accommodations, and that's from her IEP. And the curriculum is based on the standards of learning, not the Virginia Essentialized Standards of Learning. She performs functional life skills with minimal supports. And it looks like we have Deb back. Deb, do you want to pick back up on criterion 4?
Yes, I will. Thank you.
Sure.
For criterion 4, Megan really does not meet this criterion. She is able to access the curriculum and generalized skills with minimum support. So if we look at criterion 5, Megan would not meet this particular criterion either, because she is working towards the standard diploma. I know she's a 5th grader and that's not often talked about at that age, but that is she's in the general curriculum and she's pretty much working towards that at this point. Is Megan eligible for participation in the VAAP? No, she does not meet the eligibility criteria for participation in the VAAP assessment. She received no's on everything in the criteria except for the yes, she has an IEP, so she would not be eligible to participate. So let's look at Ralph. Ralph is the 10th grade student who has been identified with multiple disabilities, including intellectual disabilities. He communicates primarily through gestures, grunts, picture exchange system. Although he has a significant weakness in reading and math, he can match pictures of like money for purchases and recognize the signs in his environment, such as in his community, his favorite food restaurants. He does need assistance with self-care, and he's working actually towards an applied studies diploma. If we look at him a little bit more academically, with the use of picture cues, he can match coins and dollar bills. And in reading, he lacks the expressive verbal language skills. He's pretty much a non-reader, but identifies community signs, and he uses a stamp to sign his name. So for criterion 1, yes, Ralph meets this because he has a current IEP and he's enrolled in grade 10. Criterion 2, does he demonstrate a significant cognitive disability? Yes, based on the review of all the resources we have on Ralph, we can pretty much say that he does meet the criterion of having a significant cognitive disability. Criterion 3, if we look at his curriculum and his instruction, he does meet this criteria. He receives VSOL instruction in the classroom with accommodations according to his IEP. His curriculum, again, is based on the VSOLs, not the SOLs. And he does require quite a bit of assistance and supports to perform functional life skills. Criterion 4, he does meet this criterion. Ralph does meet, he is unable to access the curriculum and generalized skills without intensive instruction and extensive supports. And then when we're looking at criterion 5, he is working on goals other than that for the standard or advanced studies diploma. So the answer to this is yes, he's actually working towards an applied studies diploma. So is Ralph eligible for participation in the VAAP? Yes, Ralph does meet the eligibility criteria for participation in the Virginia Alternate Assessment Program.
All righty.
Now, yeah, whoops. Now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Jeff Fennessy. Thank you, Jeff.
All right. No, thank you, Sarah, for picking up on, and thank you, Deb, for that also. My name is Jeff Fennessy. I'm the director of the Office of Special Education Program Improvement. That's the office that's responsible for monitoring compliance with applicable special education laws and regulations. So first, we're going to take a look at those federal law requirements. The Every Student Succeeds Act, known as ESSA, limits the total number of students with the most significant cognitive disabilities who are assessed statewide with the VAAP to 1% of the total number of students in the state who are assessed in that subject, including math, reading, and science. This is often referred to as the 1% cap. If a state anticipates that it'll exceed the 1% cap for any subject, the state may request that the U.S. Department of Education waive the cap for that subject for 1 year. Virginia applied for and received a waiver to exceed the 1% cap in all content areas for the 21-22 school year last year. The documents related to that waiver are on the VDOE's website. The waiver does not alleviate any implications for divisions, however. So let's take a look at those implications. ESSA further stipulates divisions with more than 1% participation in the VAAP in a subject area must provide to the state assurances that the IEP team adhered to the state's participation guidelines, including the students participating in the VAAP have been instructed in the VSOLs. We also need justification for the participation rate over 1%. So that'd be a written statement. And finally, assurances that the parents are informed about the consequences for their child's participation in the VAAP. These assurances and justification statements from the school divisions were collected by VDOE special education staff through a survey last fall. You'll once again be receiving that same information and request for this upcoming 22-23 submission. We're also responsible for monitoring the VAAP participation rates. VDOE monitoring staff will identify school divisions with student groups that disproportionately participate in the VAAP by disaggregating the VAAP participation data at the school division level by primary disability, gender, race, ethnicity, and grade level to reveal any trends in disproportionality. Particular attention will focus on student participation in areas not traditionally associated with significant cognitive disabilities, such as other health impairments, learning disabilities, and speech language impairments. VDOE monitoring staff will review local policies, procedures, and practices around the implementation of the state's participation guidelines for compliance, as well as asking local leadership staff to do an individual record review of certain student files for evidence that the appropriate decisions for participation in the VAAP are made by the IEP teams. All right, so here's a chart of the students that we're talking about. This chart represents 780 students, or approximately 10% of the total VAAP participants last year, 21-22. All students on this chart were coded with a primary disability not traditionally associated with significant cognitive disabilities. As I previously stated, this group of participants will be the focus of the VDOE's targeted reviews this fall. A few high-level observations include, well, as you can see, OHI is the vast majority of these students. But if you dig a little deeper, and what isn't on the chart is students in elementary school represent the largest group, with third grade being the largest of all grade levels participating in the 21-22 school year. On the surface, there does not seem to be any statewide discrepancy in the ratio of male to female. However, there does seem to be a discrepancy in the number of Black students with disabilities who are participating in the VAAP, at least last year. As we meet internally, we're going to continue to disaggregate this data and conduct targeted reviews beginning this fall. And I think at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Leah to look at some practice items.
Thanks, Jeff. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Leah Mason. I am the alternate assessment specialist in the Office of Student Assessment, and I'm just going to spend a brief moment with you talking about practice items. And this becomes step 2 in the process in determining how eligible students will access these VAAP practice items. So the VAAP practice items for this year, we'll have 12 items that will be available for teachers and students to access in each grade level and each content area in an online and a paper format. As some of you may have been aware, we only had 7 items last year, but this year we were able to update some of our existing practice items and add some additional practice items. So the purpose of these practice items is to have teachers and students familiarize the students with the formats of the test items, as well as those tools that will be available in the TestNav platform that's used for our state assessments. All eligible students can have access to both a paper copy of the practice items as well as the online version of the practice items for the test. The new VAAP practice items can be available or will be available mid to late September this year. You can locate these VAAP items, as Sarah shared before, on our homepage where our VAAP resources are. Once you go to that VAAP page, if you look at the top of the page, which is shown here on your screen, there's a page content area at the very top of the page. And if you click on the link that says VAAP sample and practice items, that will then take you to the practice items section on the website, which looks like this. And this section you will come to first will be the paper copy that you can access the paper copy and the examiner's copy of the practice items for reading, mathematics, and science in all of the grade levels. And if you are looking to use the online version of the practice items, right below this section, you will find, which is what's on my left-hand side, the VAAP sample practice items, and you will see online presentation, which will be directly below the paper copies. And that red button that says sample and practice items, that's what you will click. That will then navigate you to what's here on my right of the TestNav platform. Once you get to that TestNav platform, you want to make sure that you go all the way over to your far right-hand side and click on VAAP, and then select the corresponding grade level and content area that you need for items in which you want to have your students to have access to. Now, in using the practice items for students, you definitely want to select the practice items in the content areas in which your students are enrolled in. And then based on your knowledge of the student, you need to determine which format is going to be the most preferable. If it's going to be the online format or whether or not it's going to be the paper format. And there may be some instances where you can administer both the paper and the online format. Now, the use of the practice items are going to really be important to help you determine, most importantly, how your students are going to interact with these VAAP items, whether it's paper format or whether it's an online format. It will help you determine the number of items that your student will be able to answer in one sitting. And then it will also help your students that are using the online format to be familiar with the features that are available in TestNav. It will help you to establish the types of testing conditions that are going to be available to your students to access these items, as well as the types of accommodations that your students may need access to, that you may have to go back and have some conversation with the IEP team. But ultimately, addressing these bullets that are located on your screen will help you in developing the student's test plan. So it's definitely important to use these practice items with your students. How students respond to the practice items. Students can enter their responses either on the online in TestNav, or they can indicate their responses on the paper, or if they need to indicate their responses to the examiner using whatever mode of communication modality they use in regular instruction. In turn, the examiner will record those students' responses in the examiner's copy, and they will do that regardless to whether or not the student is accessing these practice items through the paper version or the online version of the test and the practice items. So let's talk about the examiner's copy for just a moment. The examiner's copy is included in the beginning of the paper copy of the student's practice items. This examiner copy is really important. It has vital information that should be read to the students, whether they are accessing the practice items through paper format or the online version of the practice items. Now, if your students are going to be using the online practice items, there is the text-to-speech feature that is used there, and the examiner doesn't have to read the information for each test item because the text-to-speech contains the exact same information that's located in the paper copy. So we're going to go through some examples to really kind of talk about why it's important to have the examiner's copy present with you when you are using the practice items. So for example, let's look at this mathematics item. For this math item, the examiner's copy will always have directions there, and the directions in the examiner's copy will differ from one item to the next. So you want to make sure you definitely read through it to see what is going to be expected of the examiner. So if you look at this particular item, what's highlighted in yellow are the directions that are specific to the examiner. They're going to always be in the parens. So for this particular item, we're looking at a number line, and it says here's a number line from 1 to 10. Here are numbers 1, 3, and 10. The examiner's copy, the directions there specify for the examiner to point to the numbers 1, point to the number 3, and point to the number 10 on the student materials. This could be a support that the student needs in order to access this item. If a student is accessing a paper practice item like this, or the online practice item, and you don't have the examiner's copy, that support could be missing from that student to really provide an authentic response to how they would access this question. So please make sure that you are using using the examiner's copy with your practice items with your students. Another reason the examiner's copy is important is to avoid cluing. Here's another math example where the examiner copy specifies for the examiner to point to the student materials. In this particular item, the student materials here will be those answer options. So in this example, it reads here are 3 expressions. In the yellow, which is the directions that are specific to the examiner's copy, it asks for them to point to the student materials. And then which expression matches the statement 35 minus 15, A, B, or C. So here it's important that you realize that as an examiner, you're only going to point to the student materials so that you don't give away too much information and still be able to receive a true response from the student using this type of practice item. And lastly, this particular item, which is a reading example, the directions here, the examiner copy specifies for the examiner to point to the answer choices only. Now in reading, because this particular item, the student is expected to read their answer choices independently. Remember, there are some items in reading in which the student is expected to read independently. And if you are having your students sit with practice items and you don't have that examiner's copy, you may not recognize which item is expected for the student to read independently. So here, the examiner is just to point to the answer choices. What does he bring? But do not read the answer choices. Now, if your student happens to have the read aloud accommodation, then of course they can have access to that read aloud accommodation for this particular item. But again, you want to make sure that overall, when you're sitting with your students, you having access to those practice items, using those examiner's copies with those embedded directions will help the students be provided with whatever supports that the directions may offer. You don't want to provide any cluing to any of the practice items. And you want to be able to allow students that are able to read these items independently to have that opportunity to do so. And that will give you a big picture of how they authentically respond to your practice items, so that when you get to the point of preparing their student test plan, you can start to make some informed decisions about the specific types of testing conditions the students may need, or if there are any accommodations that the student may need that you need to revisit with the IEP team. So the examiner copy is still very important to have access to, even when you are using and having your students familiarize themselves with the practice items for the VAAP test. And that concludes my section. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Sharon Seiler so that she can go through the student test plans. Sharon.
Thank you so much, Leah. I am Sharon Seiler, and I'm a staff member in the Office of Student Assessment at the Virginia Department of Education. Well, up to this point, you've been walked through the first two steps that we think are absolutely essential and critical to preparing students to participate in the VAAP test. The first step being, as Deborah shared, is identifying the appropriate students. And it is a very small population that really has a cap on the number of students that can participate in this test. And secondly, as Leah shared, that second critical step is exposing the student to the format of the test, to the features that are available online, giving them access to what a paper test looks like. And that's done through the practice test. And so now I want to talk about the third step, which is developing a plan, really, that documents all of the information that you've gleaned from the practice items, as well as the information that you know as a teacher about your student. That information could be based on what you've seen in classroom performance, but also what you see in the students' records. So let's talk about the student test plan. Earlier in the beginning of this presentation, Sarah talked about a survey that had been done with special education directors and division directors of testing and teachers. And what we found through that survey that she shared is that most school divisions are requiring or either strongly encouraging teachers to use practice tests, or practice items, I should say, and then going that second step in terms of developing a student test plan. So that's really why we can say with great confidence this afternoon that student test plans are really an excellent preparation tool for students, and that one should be created for each eligible student based on the information that you have at hand from the practice items and information that you have as a classroom teacher. The plan actually is going to do two things. One being that it's going to document what is needed to provide an optimal test environment for each student based on the student's individual needs. If there's one thing that we all know for sure about the population of students who participate in the VAAP, even though it's a small number of students, it is a very diverse group of students. So this plan is going to help you really focus on each student's individual need and documenting what, based on those needs, are going to need to be provided to create a testing environment so that the student can demonstrate their knowledge and skills. The second thing that the plan will do for you, which is very important, that it is a tool for sharing information with the vast number of people that need to know. The examiner who's giving the test to the student, the school test coordinator, school leadership, the student's parents, and of course, the IEP teams. So what I want to walk you through now is what you're going to find in the student test plan document. This document can be found, as we shared about many of the other resources, can be found on the VAAP page of the VDOE website. And when you go to our website and you click on Virginia Test Plan Template, you're really going to find there all that you need. And so you're going to find access to the VAAP practice items. You're going to find two sets of guiding questions. One set of questions if the student is taking the online practice items. The other set of questions are for students who are taking the paper version of the practice items. Then you're going to find the actual test plan form. That's where you record and document all of the information that you have gathered. And then there's an appendix to this document, which is very important. It includes all of the testing conditions that can be used for the VAAP and all of the individual test accommodations. So everything you need in terms of a resource to develop the student test plan and document the student's needs is going to be found in one place. So let's take a look at what the actual template form looks like. As you can see, there's in the left-hand column a number of topics: testing location, the number of test sessions, the test delivery format. And then in the right-hand column, that's going to be the place where you record as a teacher the information that you have gleaned for your student. And a little bit later, we're going to walk through what this plan would look like for an actual student. But we're coming to that very, very shortly. So here is the list of testing conditions that are currently available for the VAAP. Now, on this slide, you're only seeing the test conditions listed out. But when you get to the student test plan document, there is additional information on each of these testing conditions. But for now, if you just kind of briefly glance at this list, you will see a variety of supports that can be offered to students. For example, in terms of timing and scheduling, the first bullet under this section is multiple test sessions. We know that many students in this population may not be able to complete all 35 test items at one time. So it is permissible for a student to have multiple test sessions that may occur even over multiple days. If you look at the presentation group, there are a wealth of supports there that can be used for students. Manipulatives, calculators, visual aids. So the main thing to remember and keep in mind as you're developing your plan to support students and address their individual needs is that these testing conditions are available to all students. You don't have to go through the student's IEP team, but in the student test plan, you want to make sure that you document the student's need for these conditions on that plan. The next slide talks about the individual test accommodations for the VAAP. And you can see that the VAAP is very different from the SOL test, because for VAAP, we only have 4 individual accommodations. Braille for your blind or visually impaired students, interpreting and transliteration, the read aloud accommodation, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about in the next couple of slides, and the alternate representation of response options. Now, again, in the appendix of this document, you're going to find that more information is provided explaining each of these accommodations. The thing that you always want to keep in mind, though, is that test accommodations do have to be documented in the student's IEP. It's not enough just to put it on the student's test plan. You're going to have to go a step further, convene the IEP meeting, and to make sure that that accommodation is documented there. Okay, so let's move on now to talk a little bit about the read aloud accommodation. One of the things that we know about the VAAP that you have heard referred to earlier in this presentation is that most of the items on the VAAP are read to the student. They're either read to the student by the text-to-speech feature online that is a part of TestNav, or if the student is taking a paper test, the examiner can read the item to the student. But there are a few items which are mostly in reading that really require the student to read the item independently. Those may be the items, and based on the student needs, where the student would benefit from having the read aloud accommodation. So this particular accommodation provides additional support for students who have a disability that really impacts their ability to access text. And most often, these are students who access content primarily through an auditory mode. Now, the read aloud accommodation can be used in the online version of the test, but that's going to mean that the text to speech feature is going to have to be turned off. And of course, it can also be used for the paper version of the test. When the read aloud accommodation is used, the examiner really has to be sure to read the item exactly as it's written, using a natural tone of speech and a natural manner of speech. And this helps you to avoid cluing. Now, when it comes to the practice items, particularly the new practice items that we have added, Leah mentioned that in the past, we only had 7 or so practice items last year. We've expanded that number to 12 items across content areas and across grade levels. You're going to find items in those reading practice items that really require the student to read independently. And that's going to give you a clue there as you administer those items, whether this read aloud accommodation might benefit your student. And again, the read aloud accommodation, like all the individual accommodations, it does have to be documented in the student's IEP. Now, a word about the alternate representation of response options. Last year, with this population of students, of course, this was an accommodation that was used by many, many students. And what the alternate representation of response option does, it allows for the 3 answer options or the 3 answer choices to be represented in a different way. And we allow those answer options to be represented in a different way because that's going to provide the student a way to respond in a way that is familiar to the student. So for example, if the student uses choice cards in instruction, well, the alternate representation of response options allows the 3 answer choices on the test to be made into choice cards. Another example is physical objects. Physical objects can be used for answer choices. So an example would be if the item is about time, the student would be allowed to use a real clock to respond to for those items. If the student is familiar with and uses in their regular instruction actual coins and bills, again, those answer choices that are represented in numbers could be replaced with actual money. And then we know, of course, that many students do use a picture exchange system in their classroom instruction. So the alternate representation of response option would allow the picture exchange system to be used for answer choices. And again, and you've heard it many, many times now, this particular accommodation, as well as the other 3, do have to be documented in the student's IEP. So let's take a look at the guiding questions. And as you can see, I mentioned earlier that there are 2 sets of questions, one for online practice items and one for paper practice items. But the questions are very similar with that first question, the first bullet you see listed here, really is asking for the teacher to take note as to how the student interacts with test items for the online test items that are presented on a computer. A similar topic here for the paper test, the same thing. How does the student interact with test items presented on paper? The second question is about the testing location. And this question certainly requires thought for this population. We are concerned with the test location for our general ed students or for students with disabilities who are taking the SOL test. Well, it's also an issue for this population of students in that you want to identify a location that is comfortable for the student, but it's also free from distractions, so that the student can appropriately attend to the test. The third bullet on both sides is a guesstimate, if you will, based on, again, what you're seeing from the student performance on the practice items, as well as what you're seeing in the classroom. So the question is, how many items can your student do in one sitting? This is going to give you information to determine whether the student is going to need multiple test sessions, and then if the student does need multiple test sessions, how many sessions are going to be needed for the student to complete a 35-item test. This fourth bullet on both sides, again, is very important because it has to do with how students enter their answer choices. In the online test, can the student enter their answer choices independently in TestNav? Or do you, as the examiner for the practice items, do you need to enter the students' responses for them? It's certainly allowable either way for the student or the examiner. But again, those practice items are going to give you specific information about this question. The same thing is true for the practice test, for the paper practice items. Can the student mark his answer on the student copy? Or if the student can't do that, then you're able to note that and say that the examiner is going to need to record the student's responses. That's very important information. And then finally, we know, we said earlier that most of the items are read to the student. So if the student is taking the online test, how does the student respond to text to speech? There are features in TestNav that allow you to slow the speech down or to change the volume of the text to speech feature. So all of that, again, all of that information can be recorded in the student test plan. And of course, on the paper side, how does the student respond to your reading the items? We know of the TestNav platform really has a variety of features that can help students. Color contrast, magnification, zoom, so many features. And again, the practice items are going to give the student a chance to explore those features, and for you as a teacher to decide which are going to be most helpful to your students. And then the last two bullets on either side really get into the identification of the test conditions that are going to be provide your student with the most support, and the individual accommodations that are going to need to be identified, but also taken to be discussed with the student's IEP team. So let's walk through the development of a plan for a student. We were introduced earlier in this presentation to Ralph. Ralph was a student who was found eligible to participate in the VAAP, and he's a 10th grade student. But the interesting thing to note here is that Ralph's school division uses high school flexibility in the administration of the VAAP test. And what that means is that school divisions are allowed to spread the high school test across grade levels if they so choose. So in Ralph's case, his school division decided to administer the VAAP reading test for grade 9, the VAAP math test in grade 10, and then the science test in grade 11. So we know then that as a 10th grader, the only test that Ralph is focused on and that we need to give him practice items for and to develop a plan for is the VAAP math test, because of the high school flexibility decision that was made by his school system. When we look at Ralph, the way he communicates, you'll remember that he is a nonverbal student, that he communicates primarily through gestures, making noises or grunts, but he also uses a picture exchange system. That's valuable information that we can translate into the development of Ralph's plan. He does have significant weaknesses in reading and in math, but when it comes to math, what's been identified for him is that he can appropriately match pictures of money to make purchases, and he recognizes signs in his environment. And an example would be his favorite fast food restaurant chains. We know in terms of computer use that Ralph is not a frequent computer user. He hasn't really used it at all. So his teacher, because of that, is appropriately going to gravitate towards the high school math practice items on paper, and would use those paper guiding questions to glean information and then to create Ralph's student test plan. So let's see what his teacher comes up with. In terms of the location, for Ralph's test, she administered the practice items in the classroom for Ralph. He's very familiar with that setting, so it was a comfortable place for him, a place where he could focus on the test. So that's going to be the preferable location for Ralph's VAAP testing later on in the spring. She was also able to make some determination on the number of test sessions for Ralph. Again, administering the practice math practice test items, the teacher saw that Ralph really needed extra time, and to be able to complete a 35 item test, he would likely need 3 or 4 sessions. Day and time of testing, the teacher is taking advantage of what she knows about Ralph, knowing that he enjoys a fast food lunch. So she decides to administer the practice test items, which is later going to translate into the actual test, in the late morning, and then use his lunchtime maybe as a natural break for him, but perhaps even as a motivator for math for Ralph. We know that the test delivery is going to be in the paper format, but Ralph, with the paper format, is going to take advantage of some of the testing conditions available. Individual testing is one of the test conditions. the multiple sessions, which we've already talked about, the use of visual and verbal prompts, manipulatives. And then Ralph is not able to mark his own answers. So the examiner knows that he or she is gonna have to record Ralph's responses. In terms of the accommodations that are needed for Ralph, you probably already guessed that the alternate representation of response options is going to be the way to go with Ralph, because he uses real money in his classroom environment. He uses a picture exchange system in the classroom environment. So that's going to be an accommodation that would really be appropriate for Ralph to use real money in the picture exchange on some of the answer items on the practice test, but also, of course, on the actual VAAP test. And then in terms of communication, the first being with the school test coordinator. The VAAP does allow for teachers to have access to the VAAP test, mainly so they can prepare the test for the student. So in this case, the teacher is going to be sharing this test plan with the STC for one reason, so that she can get advanced access to the test, so that she can make the adjustments for the alternate representation of response options. She plans to present answer options using real coins and dollars on items involving money. And she also plans to replace answer options with pictures from Ralph's system. And of course, that's going to take time. So she's here, the teacher is letting the STC know that I'm going to need advanced access to prepare Ralph's math test. The second communication focus on this plan is for the administration of the school, because the teacher is going to need to request times to schedule an IEP meeting. Again, because of the testing accommodation of alternate representation of response options, that has to go through the IEP team, and that has to be scheduled. So the teacher is not waiting to the last minute to do that, but is making that need known and making that request to schedule that IEP team meeting. But she also does something else that I think is really, really wise and important in this case. Prior to the IEP team meeting, the teacher wants to meet with Ralph's parents to discuss changes in the VAAP. Because when you think about it, Ralph, as a 10th grade student, was likely exposed in the earlier grade to the portfolio-based VAAP. And because the VAAP has changed so much, she wants to have the opportunity to discuss those changes before the IEP team meeting, and to give the parents a chance to ask questions and for her to provide answers for them. And of course, that meeting before the IEP team meeting with the parents is likely going to make the IEP team meeting go a lot smoother. So that then is Ralph's test plan. And now you have all 3 steps for preparing your students at this point for the spring 2023 administration of the VAAP. Selecting the right students, using the practice items, and then developing student test plans. And I'm going to turn things back over to Sarah.
All right, thank you very much, Sharon. And we're going to address some questions that we know that we have received. So we put them in the presentation in advance. So we'll go ahead with the first one. The teacher plans to meet with her students' parents soon. And so she's asking, what can she do to prepare them for VAAP? And we have two suggestions that we're offering. One is an informational video that is about 23 minutes long. It discusses the changes in the VAAP between the old VAAP and the new VAAP, and then talks about the essentialized standards of learning, and then also gives some sample items in each of the content areas. So that's available. And then the other piece is a frequently asked questions document, which has questions and answers related to the old and new VAAP, eligibility, and then also some content area specific information. Okay, if a student with a disability is not passing SOL tests, grade level classes, or local benchmark assessments, is the student automatically eligible to participate in VAAP? And the answer to that one is no. Students need to demonstrate significant cognitive disabilities. They have to meet all of the criteria for participation in VAAP to be eligible. So not passing a grade level class or not passing an SOL test or benchmark tests really does not compose a automatic qualification for VAAP. And then if a student is working towards an applied studies diploma, is the student automatically eligible for the VAAP? And the answer to this one is also no. Again, focusing on that VAAP criteria, all of those 5 elements need to be met. There are some students who are participating in SOL assessments and they're working toward an applied studies diploma. Okay, so at this point, we'll take a look and see if we have any other questions that have come in. I did want to point you to these 2 email addresses, however. Deborah Johnson is our specialist in the Department of Special Education and Student Services, who presented on eligibility and participation in the Virginia Alternate Assessment Program. So she would be happy to take any questions that you have by email. And then also we've provided the email to our Student Assessment Office. So we're happy to receive your questions there as well. And it looks like we have a pretty empty slate of questions this afternoon. So I know that we did receive a couple questions about where are the Virginia Essentialized Standards of Learning, and those are available on that VAAP resource page that we referred you to earlier in the presentation. That is also where we'll be providing this recorded video of the presentation, and we will be emailing you the presentation slides as well. So we will provide those to you after this presentation. Let's see, we've got a couple things coming in here. There's a question about what's occurring with history, and as far as history and writing, we have some information that we'll be sharing with you to support what we did last year. Actually, it's no different than what we did last year. The history and writing are going to be assessed through a local collection of evidence. So similar to the old VAAP, except for the fact that they will not be entered, those scores will not be entered in Pearson Access Next. So work samples will be used for history, for elementary history, and also for middle school history, and for middle school writing. So local collections will be required to be completed for those areas of assessments. Okay, and it looks like we have a request for us to provide more examples of the alternate response options accommodation. So we will take that one back and keep that one in mind, that we need to provide some additional feedback there. Okay, and we have your email addresses from the registration for the Zoom session today, so we'll definitely get you the presentation slides so you have those. And again, we appreciate your participation on a Wednesday afternoon. This was module 1, so there will be additional modules coming up later this fall. We'll be in touch with division directors of testing and directors of special education about the modules 2 through 4 that will be offered. So more information to come related to VAAP. Your best, one of the best places to look is that VAAP resource page. And then also a contact point would be your special education director or your division director of testing. But again, thank you very much for jumping on here this afternoon and hanging with us. We appreciate it, and we'll certainly be in touch with you. And as we wrap up here, there's a question here about that local assessments, the collections of evidence. Can I confirm that those are not required for high school? And that is correct. For writing and history, they are not required at the high school level because these students are not seeking verified credit. So it is elementary and middle school that the local assessments in history and writing need to be completed. And there was a question of whether we have a local grade level pacing guide, and we do not. The Virginia Essentialized Standards of Learning are the document that we're providing that includes a complexity continuum, but it is not a pacing guide. So that is something that needs to be addressed from a local instructional perspective.